A good number of members of the church, when speaking on gospel topics of a more complex nature, will often quote emphatically, with no reservation, from a 26-volume collection of public sermons called, yes, you guessed it, the Journal of Discourses, Brigham Young being the most quoted with over 300 sermons from General Conference. It fundamentally served the same purpose as the General Conference issue of the Ensign. But is it still okay to liberally quote from its sermons? Is it LDS canon? Is it considered all to be flawless, heaven-sent doctrine? The Journal of Discourses is a 26-volume collection of public sermons by early leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The first editions of the journal were published in England by George D. Watt, the stenographer of Brigham Young. It was first published in the year 1854. Eventually, 32 years later, it came to a halt in 1886. The journal is one of the richest sources of early Latter-day Saint theology and thinking. It includes 1,438 sermons given by 55 church leaders, including most numerously Brigham Young, John Taylor, Orson Pratt, Heber C. Kimball, and George Q. Cannon. Orson Pratt being one of the most that I've heard quoted myself. The journal was the proposal of George D. Watt, who was Brigham Young's stenographer. Watt had recorded several early sermons in Pitman shorthand. So he basically recorded all the sermons in shorthand and proposed to the LDS Church that this and other material be published, with printing to be done in England where printing costs were cheaper. The First Presidency immediately approved the idea and officially granted Watt the privilege of preparing and publishing them. Watt recorded the material in the first 4 volumes of sermons himself, and he continued to contribute through volume 12, but at least 11 other stenographers were involved. After recording, so what does that tell you? There were many different stenographers. A lot of it was done in shorthand. Most of it, I think all of it was done in shorthand. You're going to lose some of the meaning of what was preached. We're going to learn a little bit about that in a second. After recording the sermons, Watt transcribed them and sent them to the speaker for careful review. By far, Young has the most sermons recorded in the journal with 390. It was said that Brigham Young secured stenographic reports of his addresses. As he traveled among the people, reporters accompanied him. All that he said was recorded. Practically all of these discourses, from December 16th, 1851 to August 19, 1877, were published in the Journal of Discourses, which was widely distributed. The public utterances of a few great historical figures have been so faithfully and fully preserved. For at least the first volume, Young personally edited his own sermons. For future volumes, Young helped to select which sermons should be included in the publication, and he assigned his personal secretary to carefully edit the manuscript pages before publication. The full title of the journal was inconsistent across volumes. The title of the first volume was Journal of Discourses by Brigham Young, President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, his 2 counselors, the 12 apostles, and others. That was the whole title. In Volume 6, the title was shortened to Journal of Discourses by President Brigham Young, his 2 counselors, the 12 apostles, and others. In some of the first 19 volumes, the word delivered was added to the title to precede the word by. Some of these volumes omitted the words and others, quote, close quote, and some replaced the phrase, quote, his 2 counselors, close quote, with, quote, his counselors, close quote. Volume 20 was the first published after the death of Brigham Young, and the title used was Journal of Discourses by President John Taylor and other members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. Also remarks by other prominent elders. Volume 21, published after John Taylor had been ordained as Young's successor to the office of President of the Church, adopted the title Journal of Discourses by President John Taylor, his counselors, the 12 apostles, and others, which remained consistent until the final 26th volume. The journal was highly esteemed in its day and considered to be an authoritative source of Latter-day Saint teachings. The preface to the 8th volume, written by Apostle George Q. Cannon in 1861, stated, "The Journal of Discourses deservedly ranks as one of the standard works of the Church, and every right-minded saint will certainly welcome with joy every number as it comes forth from the press as an additional reflector of the light that shines from Zion's hill." Although it was privately printed, the Journal of Discourses was considered to be an official publication of the LDS Church. However, its contents were not always considered to be official statements of doctrine. The Church currently states that the publication is not an official church publication. It has encouraged its members to focus instead on canonized scripture. I thought that would be interesting. I don't like Wikipedia as a major source of information, but as I read it, I thought, yeah, this will work. This will be okay. So this was from Wikipedia. But what we're going to learn in part 2 is that the church never distanced itself from the Journal of Discourses. It was never a standard work like the scriptures. And the word standard work, that phrase, that term, had a different meaning back in the mid-1800s with the church than it does today. We're going to learn all that in part 2 of Journal of Discourses. And also that it was a private publication. It was never considered a part of the church's official publications. It was a private publication, but the brethren liked it because that it recorded a lot of sermons that apostles and prophets gave. Now I'd like to read you what the church has said on the subject. The Journal of Discourses is not an official publication of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It is a compilation of sermons and other materials from the early years of the church, which were transcribed and then published. It included some doctrinal instruction, but also practical teaching, some of which is speculative in nature, and some of which is only of historical interest. So emphasized here is speculative in nature. So not all the material is considered 100% doctrine. The content of the Journal of Discourses was transcribed sometimes inaccurately and published between 1854 and 1886 in England. The compilation contains some statements of doctrine as well as other materials of interest to Latter-day Saints who lived far from the center of the church, including speeches given for a variety of occasions, funeral addresses, reports from returning missionaries, prayers, and the proceedings of a trial. The Journal of Discourses was produced under the guidance of those who transcribed the materials, including George D. Watt, David W. Evans, and George W. Gibbs. Skilled in the use of shorthand, George D. Watt had transcribed many conferences and sermons for the Deseret News. He received little pay for his work. Since the Deseret News was not generally available outside of the United States, Watt proposed to Brigham Young the idea of publishing these materials on a subscription basis. Such a plan would make the materials available to more saints and allow Watt to earn a living with his work. President Brigham Young supported the plan, and a letter from the first presidency was included in the first volume encouraging church members to cooperate in the purchase and sale of the journal. Questions have been raised about the accuracy of some transcripts. Modern technology and processes were not available for verifying the accuracy of transcriptions, and some significant mistakes have been documented. The Journal of Discourses includes interesting and insightful teachings by early church leaders. However, by itself, it is not an authoritative source of church doctrine. So no one has ever said that it wasn't doctrinal. We just do not consider it canon. It just says some of it is speculative. and it's not considered an authoritative source of church doctrine. But no one said that there wasn't doctrine in it. So I would say feel free to quote from it, but do it maybe with the disclaimer that apostles and prophets have had strong opinions, they are fallible men, and they gave strong, good arguments, being supported by strong, sound doctrine. So, in part 2, I'm going to be reading from Fair Mormon, fairmormon.org. Fair Mormon stands for the Foundation for Apologetic Information and Research. It's basically a staff of folks and volunteers who are students of the scriptures, ancient languages, early Christian history, early LDS history, and LDS doctrine and apologetics and so forth. So they've got, I'm going to be reading something from their online internet-based apologetics place. We're going to learn that the Journal of Discourses will be often quoted by critics of the church and used against members of the church, but fear not, it's not all what it's wrapped up to be. So stay tuned for part 2.